Planet Earth. Across the vastness of space, a mere dot in the Milky Way galaxy. Vibrant with life, it has no known equal in the entire universe. Among Earth's 8 million species, most impressive of all, human beings.
My awe at the way in which human beings are put together only grows by the day.
I am completely grateful to be alive in this spectacular place. I wish you were a recipient for my gratitude.
The explanation that there is a God who made it to be like this is the most rational one.
People think that you need something else, a God or whatever, to make that amazing. We just need to open our eyes to see the glory of nature just for what it is.
Early attempts to explain life occur in ancient scriptures, which appear to tell the story of a creator God who simply spoke life into being.
That idea is of no help at all.
The publication in 1859 of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species provided a scientific alternative.
There's much better evidence for the evolutionary story than for the God story.
But the insistence on choosing evolution or God is being vigorously challenged by some scientists.
To claim that here's the scientific account and here's the creationist account, and that's the only two possible choices, is profoundly mistaken.
Respected scientists still insist on there being gods. I simply don't understand that.
At the heart of a raging controversy is whether belief in God is compatible with evolution or if Darwin truly dispensed with the Creator. Until Charles Darwin made his impact on the world, how life had emerged and developed had been deeply puzzling. Darwin's insights famously shed scientific light on an unsolved mystery.
Darwin is the Newton of biology. Darwin provided us with the first comprehensive theory of biology that solves so many puzzles.
The idea that organisms, including us, all came from, as Darwin said, one or a few forms, and that ultimately we all came from inorganic matter, and it all happened naturally, no miracles.
The bacterium, the tree, you, me, we all descend from a common microbial ancestor.
Darwin's theory of evolution explores the process through which all of life on Earth evolved over millions of years from one single cell. The theory has dominated scientific thinking for over 1.5 centuries.
Evolution is no longer a debated explanation for the relatedness of living things in mainstream biology.
For some scientists, Darwinism not only explains how life developed, it disposes with the Creator.
Without Darwin, we would have all this brilliant design in the biosphere and no accounting for how it got there. With Darwin, we can have a thoroughgoing naturalism. There's nothing supernatural about it.
Before Darwin came along, the apparent design of life looked like magic. And everybody thought it was magic. Everybody thought that God did it. It's so complicated, it's so elegant. Now, that was the really big problem. Darwin solved that problem.
The very conception of God has been muscled off the scientific playing field.
Some members of the Christian community also believe that evolution is hostile to God, and for that reason oppose it.
I don't find that the evolutionist approach to the science really fits naturally with theism. Genesis is primarily telling me where I come from, and it's saying, without a shadow of a doubt, that God literally took the ground and out of it made Adam.
Many Muslims also find it difficult to reconcile Darwinian evolution with their faith.
We don't accept evolution. God, He created Adam, and from Adam, all the human nation.
Darwin's idea goes through everything and adjusts everything, and people who don't want to give up the old-fashioned way of thinking are threatened by the very idea of Darwinism.
You don't need a big man with a white beard up in the sky. I think the Big Bang is a better explanation than Genesis, and I think evolution is a better explanation than the Garden of Eden.
But a significant number of scientists reject the stark choice, God or evolution. For them, evolution is evidence of God at work.
God the magician would be a God who is the stuff of cheap parlor tricks, who brings organisms into existence in a puff of smoke. I think it's a very juvenile view of God. The more sophisticated view of God is in the ultimate explanation for the natural world, the very things that we investigate scientifically.
For me, as a believer, this all makes perfect sense. This is basically science teaching us something about what was really happening with God's creative plan.
One can be both a Christian and a committed Darwinian evolutionist. I'm an enthusiastic Darwinian, and I always have been, and I've never seen any conflict between the two.
And it's something that the Roman Catholic Church has endorsed as well, that it's possible to believe in evolution and a creator. And Catholicism represents billions of Christian believers.
There is a small minority of Muslim scholars who do argue that evolution is compatible with the teaching of the Quran and that God is a creator. But in general, this topic is highly controversial.
The greatest thinkers within Judaism in the 20th century, Rabbi Kook and Rabbi Soloveitchik, both accepted the theory of evolution and integrated it into their theologies. I do likewise.
When I look around for really intelligent people who are also religious, what I invariably find is a convenient layer of gauze that covers over the tension points.
I think the notion of inherent conflict between Darwinian evolution and theism or Christianity is more apparent than real. Now, the reason it's apparent is because many people would take, for example, the story in Genesis of the origins of living organisms, and ourselves included, as a natural history. It's not a scientific document.
To read the biblical account of creation as if it were kind of scientific theory is to be tone deaf. It's just actually not what it's about at all. Genesis 1 is a polemic against myth. The idea that gods are within nature and nature is a struggle between the elements. So you have this serene unfolding of the universe. God said, "Let there be," and there was, and God saw that it was good. He has the right to ask certain things of his creations because he created us.
Many biologists believe God not only created the universe, but used evolution, a beautifully simple process, to evolve life on Earth.
The important contribution of Charles Darwin was to help us understand the processes behind such beauty and diversity. But controversially, he simultaneously became fundamental to the case for atheism.
Do atheists need evolution? Yes, yes, yes.
The compelling question is how Darwin's investigation into the processes of life emerged to threaten the existence of God, and whether such hostility is inevitable and justifiable or merely assumed.
Darwin, I believe, was never really an atheist. There are a lot of things he said he didn't know. I don't know whether he died with a belief in God. No one knows that.
The story of Charles Darwin's impact on science, as well as on the God question, began when he transferred to the University of Cambridge in 1827, having abandoned his medical studies at Edinburgh.
He read the Bible in the original Greek, and he read the classics. It was an all-around gentleman's education, so that he would be an adornment to parish society.
While at Cambridge, Darwin met his mentor, John Stevens Henslow. a devout Christian and botanist who encouraged him to take the position of ship's naturalist on HMS Beagle, setting off in 1831 on a 5-year voyage to make more accurate maps of the world's coastlines and harbours. Darwin had an inquiring mind, as well as a keen eye for detail, and was meticulous in recording and often collecting much of what he saw. Many of his collections are still studied in prestigious universities today.
Darwin's looking for laws. Ever since Isaac Newton, Christian gentlemen of science, were looking for laws of nature. He is investigating empirically the laws that God has established to govern creation. It's creation by law, not creation by miracle, which Darwin has in his sights.
By September 1835, HMS Beagle had reached the Galapagos Islands, where an important observation would lead to Darwin's fuller understanding of the laws of nature. Here, it was not so much the exotic creatures that drew Darwin's attention. Rather, it was the apparently undramatic differences in the beaks of mockingbirds and finches from different islands that began to fascinate him. Darwin wondered how these variations could be explained.
Well, these are the Darwin's finches in this collection. This bird is a ground finch, and its beak is adapted for cracking very, very hard seeds. So the beak is very deep and very broad. These individuals were better at doing certain tasks, for example, reaching into the crevices and picking up flower pollen. This bird is a cactus finch, so it has a much more narrow and much more shallow beak. Even small differences in beak morphology are important for their survival.
It was from such detailed observations of difference and the importance of those differences for survival that Darwin's theory of evolution emerged.
This is a vision of laws of nature established by God, not God directly intervening, not miracles in any sense, but God having established rules for his creation on earth, just as he has established rules for the functioning of his heavens.
If you look around the world, you have these remarkable similarities and differences among organisms. And what Darwin did is provide a unified theory for explaining this.
Having returned from his life-changing adventure, Darwin settled in Down House in the Kent countryside near London.
He was working on a big research project to explain the diversity of life on Earth.
For Darwin, Down House and its surrounding estate became a vast laboratory in which to experiment and think. He took the same reflective walk each day, pondering, inquiring, speculating. Eventually, Darwin was drawn to a fundamentally important conclusion. Just as finches evolve and change, so do all species. They're not fixed and unchanging as had traditionally been assumed. Even the changing shape of a bird's beak can lead to the eventual extinction or survival of the species. Darwin named this process natural selection.
In many ways, Darwin's theory has the aura of common sense.
That more organisms are born than can survive and reproduce, that there's therefore a struggle for existence.
And some of those are going to be more successful, those organisms, than others. And they're going to survive, and they're going to be reproductively successful.
Those that get through are different from those that don't. More than that, they get through because of their features, and that this leads to an ongoing, what Darwin called, natural selection.
Darwin deduced that naturally occurring changes acted on by natural selection are the driving force of evolution. But he also reached another dramatic conclusion, that all of life's diverse forms, including human beings, could have evolved step by step from one original cell.
Darwin took God for granted, who gave those laws to nature, the Creator. Creation, like everything else in the universe, takes place according to laws of nature which we can discover.
I encountered Darwin's idea of natural selection, and it hit me right off. Oh, good, that explains many things that need explaining. Don't need God to explain those. Seems like a miracle, but it's not. Falls right out of the laws of physics. There are laws that permit life to evolve, Do we need to posit an intelligence to set those laws up? I don't think we do.
After 2 decades wrestling with the ideas, Darwin published them in 1859 and gained support from a surprising quarter.
The leadership in the Anglican Church, within a matter of months, had basically, mostly, entirely accepted the idea.
And I think Darwin was always very aware that many of the people who accepted evolution very early on were indeed Christian believers.
Most of the problems that Darwin faced when his On the Origin of Species was published in 1859 were to do with public ridicule about the thought that we and apes might share a common ancestor.
The idea that we descended from other species, or that we had common ancestors with apes, for example, has put a lot of Muslims off the theory of evolution, including most of its religious scholars. And the idea that we are related to monkeys and pigs and everything else in the animal world is highly offensive to most Muslims.
But scientist and Anglican priest Sir John Polkinghorne finds that understanding evolution deepens his appreciation of the Creator.
Creatures are allowed to be themselves, and indeed are allowed to make themselves. That's the theological way of thinking about the processes of evolution, which have brought to birth the extraordinary fruitfulness with which the universe has been endowed. That's a much more satisfying picture of God, I think, than the sort of cosmic tyrant who has everything under tight control.
How scientists can still believe in religious ideas, in God. I find that extraordinary. It must be traceable back to an event in their childhood which kinds of embeds in a subconscious way the desire to believe.
I know what I really believe, and I really do believe that there is a God who has made himself known. I'm not making that up, and I'm not whistling in the dark to keep my spirits up. The question of truth is as essential to religion as it is to science.
Darwin's idea, one of its chief virtues, is that undercuts the only good argument there ever was for the existence of God, the argument from design.
Showing that something has a natural explanation ultimately does not take God out of the picture. And the reason for that is God, if he exists, is the author of all things natural.
What Darwin succeeded in doing was not in any remote sense refuting the existence of God. Darwin showed that if God designed the universe, he didn't design it the way 18th century scientists thought he did. He did so in a much more simple, elegant, and creative way through natural selection, which is the simplest way of generating diversity out of unity.
You can't know anything about God. You can't know whether God is good or bad or smart or intelligent. You're not actually saying anything, but just really covering up your lack of an answer with a term. I mean, if God is really outside the universe in that way, then you know, maybe God is a green snail. No, couldn't be a green snail. Why not?
Darwin himself, although he was interested in religious questions, by and large wanted to stay on the sideline with respect to these things. It wasn't really his fight. Now, Darwin's supporters, and particularly in Britain, Thomas Henry Huxley, they were very different people.
Known as Darwin's bulldog, biologist and agnostic Thomas Henry Huxley helped crystallize the argument between science and religion in a high-profile clash at Oxford with Bishop Samuel Wilberforce on the 30th of June, 1860.
Hey, silence, Professor Huxley.
My Lord Bishop, I cannot see what difference it would make to any moral responsibility if I had an ape for a grandfather.
Sir, your moral responsibility as a tutor of men is never to question the absolute authority of the Scriptures.
May I remind the Lord Bishop that we are gathered here in the interests of the advancement of science.
People like Huxley put the church very firmly in their sights as something offering the wrong ideology for the modern world.
Darwin offered them a weapon with which to attack their opponents.
What historians now believe is that the idea of a science and religion conflict is the invention of the 19th century. There are two classic publications that occur in the late 19th century that have in the titles words like the warfare of science with theology in Christendom, or the history of the conflict between religion and science. And this is the first time you get these phrases science and religion, or science and theology, and conflict and warfare.
We see something of a reflection and an echo of this going on today.
More than 150 years since the famous Huxley-Wilberforce clash, this same Oxford location resonates with the God question, as Professors Dawkins and Lennox passionately debate what light science sheds on the existence of God.
No, you asked me who made the Creator. The universe created you, Richard. Who made it then?
Everything looks designed, and so it was clearly preposterous to suggest that it was due to any kind of freak accident. Darwin came along and showed that it's not actually a freak accident, but nor is it designed.
What's coming through is that the whole process is so sophisticated, it itself is giving evidence of a rational mind behind it.
To follow the astonishing story of how that sophistication has developed, we turn to the fossil evidence in the world's rocks. It reveals how life has progressed from simple beginnings to the complex creatures we find in the world today. A triumph of mindlessness or of mind.
But the Grand Canyon really exposes an incredible length of time of Earth history. To the geologist, this is the premier landscape feature on planet Earth. In the Grand Canyon and all these layers of rocks, there are some great fossils that can be found that tell us about the evolution of life. The oldest fossils in the Grand Canyon go back 1.2 billion years.
Fossils buried in these layers of history can be excavated and studied. With scientists able to calculate the age of the rocks in which they are buried, a picture is built up of the extraordinary development of life over millions of years. But to find the most primitive forms of life, we must go back 3.5 billion years to landscape that predates even the Grand Canyon.
These structures, called stromatolites, we've got out of some of the rocks on the coast of Scotland near to Loch Torridon. Little dark bubbles, which are of course cells that were living, in this case, on a beach 3.4 billion years ago. But it looks as if the further back in time we go, the smaller and simpler the organisms get.
Over succeeding billions of years, these cells became more and more complex and led eventually to the development of early plant and animal life.
And these consortia took a very long time to eventually come together. And that wasn't really complete until nearly 3/4 of the way through Earth history, about 1 billion years ago.
Half a billion years ago, even more complex and more varied life forms began to emerge, so quickly that their development has been described as an explosion.
We have something called the Cambrian explosion, or the Big Bang of evolution, where all the different groups of animals, which were previous soft-bodied, suddenly evolved their hard parts.
Animals suddenly, within the matter of just 10 or 20 million years, developed eyes, developed appendages, developed mouths and internal organs. Those rocks are preserved inside the Grand Canyon.
Everything became complex, and it's almost like this was a turning point in the history of life on Earth. Never again has there been such an event. Once that complexity evolved for the very first time, it remained ever since. How can everything suddenly do that at the same time? It seems quite improbable if there's no direction to evolution.
There is an arrow to evolutionary time. Things are getting more complex. So we see very simple things at the beginning. We see 3.5 billion years ago, just single-celled organisms. And then maybe about 1 billion years ago, we see multicellular organisms coming into being. And then we see this huge explosion of complexity happening in the last 500 million years since the Cambrian explosion, a very good name for it, explosion of diversity.
The fossils contained in the world's rocks provide a biography of life, showing relentless progress from simple to more complex forms. And among the most valued specimens are those such as Acanthostega, which appear to show species in transition. Living around 360 million years ago, the fins of this creature are believed to have developed into limbs that eventually allowed creatures to move onto land. Professor Jennifer Clack is the world-renowned paleontologist who unearthed the remains of this creature.
The one that I've worked on shows combinations of fish-like characters and characters of things which now have legs. So it has fingers and toes, but they're not like any of those that you see around today. So it helps us to understand the way that creatures made the transition from being swimming creatures in the water with fins to things with legs.
Finally, we find ourselves here. This is like a drama where we're all actors on a stage, and it seems to me a much better explanation for the overall existence of this drama if there is a God who exists who has intentions and purposes for us on this dramatic stage.
Darwin gives us an idea which allows us to invert that, to see how purpose can arise out of purposelessness. The very process that creates all living things and eventually us itself need have no purpose at all.
Before Darwin came along, it looked perfectly obvious that even if evolution happened, there must be some guiding force to tell animals or plants how they ought to evolve. Natural selection is a blind force. The things that survive, survive.
Evolution is not blind. We make a mistake because standing within the evolutionary system, it looks as if it's completely random. Somebody who sees evolution as simply blind is just reading it at one level, but apparently random events may nonetheless be notes in a symphony that we just barely glimpse the overall shape of.
Clearly, evolution is at work driving change. The underlying question is how much of its success can be attributed to the blind process of natural selection alone.
Evolution is a fact. The best explanation that we've got for how it took place is Darwinian natural selection. If you can account for evolution without invoking a God, then God is unnecessary.
The idea that Darwin left God with nothing to do is simply false. It's false in principle. What does Darwinism propose? That there is a mechanism, natural selection. Is that in itself an argument that there is no creator who designed this mechanism? You cannot deduce atheism from Darwinism.
The reason that we live in a universe that is just bursting over with evolutionary possibilities for life is because that universe is ultimately the work of a creator who wanted it to be so.
Science itself is powerless to adjudicate on the God question. What it reveals needs to be interpreted. Some of its most staggering revelations are found in the science of genetics, which discloses more about how evolution works. We might ask whether mind or mindlessness appears to be its driving force. Darwin's theory of evolution arose from his observation that an accumulation of small changes lead to great diversity in nature, but he didn't know the cause. In 1953, the structure of DNA was discovered and produced an amazing insight about the spectacular processes driving change.
I think genetics really completes the task which Darwin began. So genetics is about the inheritance of particles that are passed down more or less unchanged from one generation to the next.
DNA has been compared to a spiral staircase, with each step containing crucial information about how to build living things.
Well, Darwin had no idea what DNA was, and yet his theory fits perfectly with the way that DNA molecules are transmitted.
DNA is a language or code providing full instructions for how a living creature is made. The instructions are carried in genes. To sense the power of the information held within just one gene, we return to Harvard University, where Professor Ajanov is investigating how altering the information in a single gene can, in this case, affect the size and shape of a bird's beak. This latest research sheds light on how these evolutionary changes might have occurred in the birds which so fascinated Darwin.
So we wanted to find how, in Darwin's finches, where beaks evolve so fast, what may be the genetic cause of this?
Professor Ajanov first isolates the gene that controls the finch's beak size and shape, and then inserts it into a chicken embryo. He can then observe how the instructions in this newly introduced gene minutely but significantly change the size and shape of the chicken bill.
By playing with the chicken bill, we're essentially repeating the types of events which occurred in Darwin's finch. It is incredible to see how quickly great diversity can be generated. In Darwin's finches, all these interesting beaks evolved in less than 500,000 years.
The full instruction manual for how any creature is made is called its genome. In the case of human beings, the genome contains 3 billion letters of DNA.
The human genome can be thought of as an instruction book. It's a book written in a funny language, the language of DNA, which has just 4 letters in its alphabet, A, C, G, and T.
And the particular order of those letters are what to determine what the genetic information says. So if the DNA spells out cat, C-A-T, that means one thing. If it's spelled out tac, just the opposite, T-A-C, it means something else. Your DNA is almost identical to mine, but it's not exactly identical. About 0.1% of our DNA bases are different. And since we have around 1 billion bases, that means that there are 1 million differences between you and me.
My awe grows by the day as these secrets get revealed, and you see what an amazing system this is, and able to produce something like the human mind from this one-dimensional 3 billion letters of script. Unbelievable.
What comes out at the end is a text. The text of the longest word we've ever discovered, the human genome, 3.5 billion letters long. Now, whatever processes are involved in that, the moment we see text with meaning, and it's a code, remember, we call it that, we infer upwards to intelligence instantly.
Life can only continue because DNA has a remarkable inbuilt characteristic. At the point of conception, copies are made. But in the process, seemingly random changes can occur. An A might replace a G. It's believed that over time, such changes or mutations drive evolution. If nature alone is the author of everything, then maybe all of life is driven by random change.
Evolution is a series of successful mistakes. By mistakes, I mean mutations, errors in copying DNA, which happen pretty much at random, so I think we can call them mistakes.
It's believed that over long periods of time, a build-up of many mutations enables the evolution of new species.
You can go to all of mammals and see the very striking similarities. There are very few genes in the human genome that you can't find a match for in a mouse or a rat or a horse or a dog.
Eventually, out of the evolutionary process, human beings are believed to have emerged in East Africa about 200,000 years ago, and thereafter spread across the world. Whether they believe in God or not, scientists are agreed that the whole evolutionary story is astounding.
I sometimes think of it as being a factory for making almost impossible things.
Life is an extraordinary process of propagating errors, and the errors might lead to you and me.
Everybody watching this program is an almost impossible thing. But to make that almost impossible thing, it's you or me, billions upon billions upon billions of creatures have died because they failed the evolution test.
Although some conclude that evolution is driven largely by chance, others see in it more than randomness.
If things are too rigid, nothing really new would happen. Equally, of course, if things were too unrigid, everything would fall apart and there would be no new things persisting. So you need a world in which there is a balance between chance and necessity, between lawful order and openness to the future. I believe that this interplay between chance and necessity reflects two of the gifts that the Creator God has given to creation.
If people wish to believe, and passionately believe, that there is a power greater than themselves which has set up the laws of nature, I have no way of disproving that belief, and as a result I am not interested in exploring that belief.
Although most believe that evolution is the best available scientific account of life, a fundamental mystery remains: the origin of life itself. Scientists believe that before life began, Earth abounded in the essential raw materials for life: ocean, atmosphere, rocks and minerals. Energy was also available in many forms. But how all of this led to the development of molecules that could copy themselves and progress the development of life remains uncertain.
There's lots of interesting speculation. Much of it is empirically informed, but we really don't have the evidence that we need to have a very compelling scientific story about how life originated on Earth.
Every living cell, including the very first on Earth, is built using the information in its DNA. The question is how that information could have originated.
The tremendous amount of engineering and information and action that has to go on to get even one cell to exist is absolutely astonishing. It's like looking at the whole universe in miniature, and that's just one cell.
It has to have accumulated by pre-cellular evolution, by natural selection. That's the most obvious process to look at.
You can shuffle chemicals and you can fill the universe with some kind of primordial soup and shuffle it for the whole age of the universe, and still you're not going to get life. Why? Because life has to do with a very special sort of thing called information. We know that natural processes can transmit information, but there's no evidence that they can originate it.
We certainly can't yet account for the onset of life. But that doesn't mean to say that we haven't got a dozen ideas. Soon we'll be able to make life anyway. We'll be able to take bottles off the shelf, mix them, as it were, and generate life. I mean, that will happen very soon.
For now, the scientific origin of life remains a mystery. But even somehow, with all the chemical processes in place to produce it, it might never have survived if planet Earth hadn't provided so many life-encouraging conditions. Perhaps by chance, perhaps by intention.
The human species is very lucky to have the environment that we have on planet Earth. Human life could not exist on Mars, it could not exist on Venus. In fact, if you just move the Earth 1 million or 2 miles away or closer to the sun, we probably would have a much different climate, and human life as we know it would not exist.
One of the most amazing things about planet Earth is that it's stayed in a very narrow range of temperatures from about 4,000 million years ago till the present day, between 0 degrees centigrade when ice freezes and 100 degrees C when water boils off and would be lost into space. And that's quite remarkable, actually, because that's what supports life as we know it. If it weren't for that, we wouldn't be here.
What we observe of planet Earth is mostly on the surface, but deep within its core are forces which continuously shape and reshape the world, allowing life to continue.
Planet Earth, it generates its own heat on the inside. As that heat reaches the bottom of the crust, it actually pulls the continents with it. And with the pulling of continents, they collide with one another, they create mountains, they create ocean basins, and there you've created all the environments where we find life today.
If, in fact, this universe, never mind the Earth, were not just the size it is, the age it is, the conditions it is, life couldn't exist, and so that's just happenstance, that's just chance. We wouldn't be here to know about it otherwise. That's one way of looking at it. Or the other way is you can say, yeah, well, there was a purpose behind this. If you believe in a God, then maybe he made it this way, or he enabled it to become this way so that life could exist. Science actually can't tell you the difference between those two answers, but certainly if you believe in God, everything about this earth is completely consistent with that, isn't it? Certainly not inconsistent with it.
So Darwin is part of the story, but he isn't the whole story. And there is still a fundamental question: why is the world the way it is? Why is it so richly potential, so that a universe that started as a ball of energy is now the home of saints and scientists? That seems to me to be a question that remains.
It's a stupendous, great thing that we're very fortunate to be part of, except there's nothing supernatural about it. That whole world of living things and meaningful things, things with reasons, is explained by one process: evolution by natural selection. If God just takes a vacation, it'll still happen.
Well, Daniel Dennett likes to argue that what evolution has done is to show us that nature is indeed self-sufficient, that nature is capable of generating the living organisms we see around us, and actually capable of generating us. In Dennett's narrow view, that alone is enough to rule out God. You have to ask yourself the question, why does the natural world work that way? And the theist answer, of course, is because the universe reflects a deeper intelligence, the intelligence of its creator. And that's one of the reasons why ultimately evolutionary biology and religious belief do not have to be in conflict.
But in linking God with evolution, there are challenges to face. Philosopher Michael Ruse has studied these challenges in detail.
Can a Darwinian be a Christian? Yes, but it's not easy, but whoever said the important questions in life are easy. Clearly, you can't be a Darwinian and believe in a very old Earth and at the same time be what in America is known as a young Earth creationist. In other words, somebody who believes in 6,000 years and 6 days of creation. I mean, those are just incompatible. So, sure, at that level there's going to be a clash. The kind of solution that were I a Christian, I would favour would be something very much along these lines. God creates through law rather than instantaneously, miraculously. It's not saying there are no miracles. One is saying, though, that the miracles are not necessarily boom, 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 but much more the miracle of the whole thing unfurling.
Plenty of people say, oh, of course there's a God. He set up the laws of physics. He set up the laws of biology, he set up the laws of mathematics. But that seems to be such a futile and empty thing to say. I mean, what are you trying to say? That idea is of no help at all in understanding mathematics, in understanding biology, in understanding life. It's just not a helpful idea. I don't see the point of it. If you want to believe it, fine, but don't ask me to believe it too.
The problem that the non-theist has is ultimately, how do you account for nature itself? Do you believe that nature is simply self-explanatory? And the answer that I give is no, I don't think so.
But even if it can be argued that the Creator is the author of the laws of nature, does the evolutionary process itself really look like the work of a good and loving God?
I would chastise him for choosing such an evil way of propagating his wishes on the earth as natural selection.
If, as it does, Darwinism works through a struggle for existence, then, and it does, then clearly you're going to have struggle, you're going to have violence, you're going to have death. Often the death is going to be very painful.
God works through evolution. I mean, if that turns out to be true, then it's yet one more piece of evidence for God being malign. Because the mechanism of evolution is so cruel.
Everything that lives will eventually die. Death is simply a part of life. It's not an act of cruelty. It's the generative power of life, birth, reproduction, culminating ultimately in death, that produces the evolutionary process and produces the grandeur that is in life itself.
God is not a sort of cosmic tyrant who is going to produce simply a cosmic puppet theatre in which God pulls every string. God is not going to be in total control of everything, create a machine-like world.
There can never be a full theological explanation of that suffering. There can only ever be a theological response. In order for the natural world to be really free and allow for free will in humans, we had to allow for this kind of suffering to take place.
One could argue then that inasmuch as God is going to create, he had to create through natural selection, and so then at some level the pain and suffering are part of a package deal.
I certainly don't think that the ordinary conditions of life are so cruel that evolution inherently conflicts with the idea of a good and gracious God.
Another area where I would want to say you've got to work pretty hard at it is over the whole existence of humankind. It seems to me that absolutely central to the Christian message or the Christian belief is that we humans are made in the image of God, that at some level we had to be.
So if God's eventual purpose was to create human beings, it appears he could have been largely relying on chance. Evolution gives no guarantees.
Had a comet not hit the Earth 65 million years ago, the dinosaurs would not have been wiped out, so the mammals would not have been able to take over, and so probably we wouldn't be here. We owe our existence literally to our lucky stars.
There is absolutely no evidence of any kind, of any forethought or design or plan or architecture in evolution. I've used the phrase that evolution is a series of successful mistakes.
I think God's creative plan included in his image, and by that I mean image of mind, not necessarily of body, because I don't think God has a physical body like ours, but certainly had the explicit intention of bringing into being spiritual creatures.
I don't think for a minute it was laid down from the beginning that five-fingered Homo sapiens in our special way, specific way, was going to come into being. But that beings of our complexity and consciousness were going to eventually to emerge somewhere in the course of history, I think was built into the universe from its very beginning.
Evolution does end up with organisms that are intelligent, and in that sense, if you reran the tape of life, you would end up with a lot of intelligence. And I suspect if you had enough time, you'd probably end up with creatures, even if they looked rather different to us, that ended up having discussions about the nature of an almighty.
I am a theist, and I'm also an evolutionist, because I think ultimately the evolutionary process exists in what a theologian would call God's providential plan.
For people who have faith in God as well as Darwin, there's a further dilemma: how to reconcile evolution with the story of origins in sacred texts. A lead researcher at London's Natural History Museum believes he has discovered an intriguing relationship between them.
The first page of Genesis is a creation account, and it has a number of steps in it. The people that wrote it had no biological training, yet they've managed to get the evolutionary history of life on Earth, as well as the cosmological history, absolutely perfectly correct. You begin with the let there be light, the universe in general, I suppose. You then move on to the sea is forming, which again is what happened in the history of the universe and the Earth. Then you go on to the evolution of life, but specifically plants. And following that, you've got this great explosion of evolution that occurred in the sea. In the Cambrian, life was exclusively marine. And then we get life moving on to land. So everything's there in the right order. I mean, the question I would have is, would the writer of that first page of Genesis have known about any of these events? Well, absolutely not. So why would he write such a thing? I fully accept everything that's been written in science. I understand how it's been rigorously tested and tested again. Yet, I'm starting to find space for God.
The story of life on our fertile planet is awesome and wonderful. And as science builds a picture of the underlying processes, a decision begs to be made about whether the success of evolution is attributable to a creator or simply to blind chance.
Systems are very good at explaining causes. The meaning of the system lies outside the system.
There's a lot of things here that make strong atheism actually the least rational of all the choices.
But the question ultimately as to how you can be a person of faith and how you can be a scientist at the same time is that faith consistent with what we know and understand through science? And I think the answer to that overwhelmingly is yes.
It's a bloody marvel that here am I, 4.5 billion years after it all started here on Earth, that I'm able to sit here talking about Darwinism. Does that prove the existence of God? No, I don't think it does. I'm a skeptic. I don't have an answer.
But all I want to believe in is the truth. And I think at the moment, God seems like a reasonable answer.
I think that I am about as certain that God doesn't exist as I am the Easter Bunny doesn't exist.
And the only evidence I would be able to adduce that God existed was that I'd had a vision that told me that God existed.
We've got to accept the level of explanation that's got the maximum explanatory power, namely an intelligent God.
I regret that there is no God, because I think the closest I will get to immortality is through medicine, and I'll just have to put up with that, I'm afraid.
These are really exciting issues that I wrestled with 50 years ago, and thank God, at least in a metaphorical sense, thank God I'm still wrestling with them now. There you are, that's a proof for the existence of God.